Now, I've always had fun playing card games, including things like poker or other games where you receive some sort of deck that you play through with other folks, and games that I tried to invent myself, like all these cards I made up as a child trying to develop some of my own card games. And perhaps some of the games that interest me the most in terms of cards are ones where not only is there some strategy in playing a particular deck, but there's a strategy in constructing the deck, in which cards you use in it. Games where there's some pool of options of cards that expands over time, and perhaps you need to figure out what would be the mathematically ideal combination of these cards to fit into some sort of deck. Recently, while trying to design some card games of my own, I decided to study the oldest game of the trading card game, collectible card game variety, older than Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh!, the game Magic the Gathering. And I figured if I wanted to know what to avoid putting in any game I designed, maybe I should study flaws from the 30-year history of this game, and perhaps by looking at the most powerful cards they had ever printed, I would see which mistakes they had made. If a card is too weak, then at worst it's going to be boring. But if a card is too strong, then at worst, it can destroy a game's ability to be fun or fair. Before I jump into my analysis of these cards, I should explain the basics of how this game works, and so I am going to spend the next few minutes explaining a simplified version of the game's rules, but if you already know how the game works or don't care, you can skip ahead. This video has timestamps of the different sections. Most forms of playing Magic involve each player having a 60-card deck, where at the beginning of the game, you draw 7 cards. If these are the land cards in my hand, which are of the type Basic Land, there are 5 total cards that are known as a Basic Land, such as the Forest, the Plains, the Island, the Swamp, and the Mountain. Those ones you can have an infinite amount of potentially in your deck, no limit, as opposed to typically needing only up to 4 of a given card in your deck at a time. Now here, I might play one of these lands to start because you can play up to 1 land per turn. They're sort of like your energy or resources. Maybe I'll play this Forest, and then I can do what's called tapping it, which is like activating it, to play something that costs 1 mana, which I could either have one that costs a generic singular mana, like that, or theoretically one that costs 1 that has to be green. But this card has to target a creature I already have out, so let's put this one into play instead. That is a type known as an artifact. You have types known as artifacts and enchantments in addition to lands. Those stay in play without attacking or blocking in the same way creatures do. Now, maybe my opponent does something random, and then on my next turn, I get to untap all of the things that have tapped, draw 1 new card, which, okay, we got another grizzly bears, awesome, and then play up to 1 more land at some point in the turn if I'd like. We'll put an island down this time, and maybe we will tap both of these to create a green and blue mana and play one of these 2 grizzly bears that we had in our hand. This is a creature that has 2 power, 2 toughness. This cannot attack right away, because when something comes into play, it turns out it has summoning sickness, means you cannot use certain types of abilities right away unless you have the ability called haste. So given that this doesn't have haste, we'll have to wait until our opponent responds with something. Then we'll untap. Maybe on this third turn, we'll do a few things. I drew another card. It was another island. I could play either the island or the forest, but just up to 1 land per turn. Since I have more green cards in my hand, maybe I'd play the forest, and maybe I would spend 1 of any type and 1 of a purely blue type to play this card called Stormcrow, which, if we were making this episode more of a meme, I would say is the most powerful card in the game, and we've determined it already. Now, maybe I would attack with my grizzly bears, which was already in turn from the last turn. And maybe I would even use my extra forest to spend a green mana to play this thing called Giant Growth that makes the creature bigger for a bit. And this could deal some damage to my opponent unless they block. There are certain rules to combat where the way to typically attack your opponent is to reduce their life total from a beginning 20 down to 0, often by attacking with creatures, maybe giving them additional stats with certain things. And if they block with one of their creatures of their own, then we have something known as combat, where the creatures have a battle and one of them or both of them may kill each other. In general, you win by either attacking with these creatures or finding other ways to reduce your opponent's life total from 20 to 0, using up to 1 land per turn, being able to untap all your stuff and draw 1 card each new turn, and being able to play cards of different types, such as the creatures, the artifacts or enchantments that have abilities of their own but don't attack or block. And this one that I buffed up the creature with is known as an instant, which is similar to the type called a sorcery. There are both types of card that die as soon as you've played them, so they have a singular one-time effect. However, instants can be played almost whenever, including on your opponent's turn. That may seem simple, but not only did I oversimplify it on purpose, over the years they've added many more different abilities and card types and so on. And in fact, if you look at some old cards, they don't seem to describe their effect properly, and you have to look at what's known as their oracle text or official rules text to see what they actually do if you play that card compared to how the old card phrased it. Additionally, most decks can't actually include every card in them, because if you included all 5 colors available, you would need to have mana resources like lands that provided all of those 5 colors, and that's less reliable under the randomness of shuffling and drawing. So most decks use like 2 or 3 different of the 5 colors, and each of these 5 colors provide different traits. For example, green provides the best way to get creatures, as well as the best way of building how many lands you have in play. White is often good at protecting things or gaining life. Blue is good at controlling or countering your opponent's resources, as well as things like drawing yourself cards. Black is best at causing your opponents to discard cards or letting you bring your dead cards back to life. Red is the best at attacking quickly or dealing damage with stuff like what's known as burn spells. Altogether, these 5 colors lie on a pentagon, where neighboring vertices are known as allied colors and opposite vertices are known as enemy colors. And this not only relates to which traits in game design are given to certain colors or not, but also relates to this whole lore that Magic the Gathering has built. As a child, I loved these fantasy books about the Magic the Gathering worlds, which did also relate to this color wheel of different attributes that different colors of magic were able to perform. If you quickly looked up what are the most powerful Magic cards ever printed, the oversimplified version you'd probably find would be a set of 9 really old cards known as the Power 9, printed in the first year of Magic the Gathering, and not only really overpowered, but also kind of notorious for being really expensive. However, when I was looking deeper into the question of what makes certain cards overpowered or not, I found that if I were to make a list of the 10 most busted cards of all time, only a few of them would be from that Power 9 list. There are other cards that are quite powerful as well. There are also many metrics we could measure how good a card is, like, are we looking at cards that are good in any deck, or cards that are super amazing in specific decks that are tailored to them? Now, as we look at different cards that are overpowered in different ways, we shouldn't only think about why the card's effect is too good. It's also interesting to analyze, why did that end up happening? Why did the game designers print that card? And there can be a variety of reasons. Some cards, like the card type known as creatures, have slowly gotten more powerful over time with a phenomena known as power creep. Power creep is a term for how game designers who have a long-term game with new expansions coming out want each new expansion to feel exciting and powerful and like something you'd want to buy even if you already have the old ones. And unfortunately, that results in some of the newer cards being like almost strictly better versions of older cards. We can't really call them completely better because maybe they have a different card type, or maybe even a weaker thing could end up being more powerful in the right circumstance. But there's a lot of old cards that have sort of gotten outpowered by newer similar versions. So some of the most broken cards are just the game designers kind of pushing it a little bit further with each new set to try and keep it exciting. Other times they've made a specific mistake, like a card or ability that they didn't realize was going to be way too powerful in conjunction with some particular deck or strategy. And then if we look further back, we'll find that despite a lot of newer cards being problematic, and maybe a trend that will continue in the future, a lot of the most overpowered cards ever are from the very first few years of designing the game. And that's partially because the game designers didn't know as much about what different resources were worth compared to each other, like how much is it worth to gain some life compared to draw some cards, compared to deal some damage, or etc. But also, some of the earlier cards were almost overpowered on purpose, because in the very first years of the game, the way the original designer, Richard Garfield, designed the game, it was basically a different game. In those early days, many of the rules were completely different. Your deck had to be 40 or more cards. Nowadays, it's 60 or more. Your deck could include any amount of copies of a given card. Nowadays, they're all capped off at up to 4 copies of a given card. And they even had this way of betting cards, like trading them and permanently giving cards to your opponent if you lost, known as anteing. Nowadays, the ante cards aren't allowed in tournaments because the game has changed so much. But back in the day, Richard Garfield, who created this game, didn't ever think that it would be so widespread and popular that people would be able to build an ideal deck list with as many copies of the right combo card. And he also thought that even if you had some overpowered cards that you had gotten from a pack, that you might lose them in this anteing mechanic where you had to bet random cards from your deck with your opponent sometimes. Cards in the earlier years had much more skewed power differences, partially on purpose and partially just because they were still figuring out how to design such a game. For example, sometimes they will make what are known as cycles, which are 5 cards that have a similar effect where there's 1 in each of the 5 colors. And there was a cycle in the very first set, Alpha, which included these 5 cards that each cost 1 mana of a particular color and have some effect related to the number 3. Now, if we look at them from least powerful to most powerful, the white one is actually quite bad. Beginning players sometimes think that gaining life is a really strong effect because your life total is like how you win or lose the game usually. And if you have enough life, it feels like you're unbeatable. And if you lose your life, it feels like you're near death. But life gain is not actually a very important way to win a game. You want to develop your board with ongoing threats, not just temporarily stall whatever threats your opponent has. So the white one here is by far the worst. You wouldn't even want to put this in a deck. Then comes the green one, which is actually a decent card. It can make one of your creatures bigger. And then you come to the red one, which is quite a good card, dealing 3 damage to any target like creatures or players, which can either damage your opponent or can wipe out one of their threats. And then comes the black one, which creates 3 mana out of 1 mana, and is a totally overpowered card that makes it too easy to play things too early for what cost they're supposed to have. And then comes the blue one, which this card, Ancestral Recall, will recur throughout this episode. It's one of those Power 9 cards I mentioned. With more than 30,000 total cards developed over time, these game designers have designed different tournament structures, or what are known as formats, for which combos of cards you're allowed to play together. Like, there are some formats known as Standard, where you're only allowed to build decks out of cards that have been released in the past few years, or tournaments known as Modern, where you're allowed to build decks from cards that have been released from some given point in the past. But there are some formats where you can use pretty much any of the 30,000 cards with a few exceptions. For example, the 2 main formats in Magic the Gathering that allow almost any card to be played are known as Legacy, where you're allowed any card that's been released with some banned exceptions, cards that you are not allowed in any form to put in your deck, and Vintage, where sometimes they'll ban a card if really needed, but typically never try and ban a card because it's too powerful. Try and restrict cards to being restricted to up to 1 copy per deck, as opposed to usually you can use 4 of any given card in your deck. So if we wanted to look at the way too overpowered cards, maybe we'd want to look at that middle ground. It turns out that there are 35 cards at the moment that are both banned in the Legacy format and restricted in the Vintage format. And it turns out that these 35 cards have a lot in common. And if we analyze this overlap, we're going to learn some interesting things about how you could create a game with more than tens of thousands of cards and have a small amount that somehow broke that structure. Let's nickname the cards in this overlap zone the superbanned cards. And since I was pretty surprised at what did and didn't show up in there, let's first think about what type of cards a player might expect to be in that zone. Like, if you were a new player especially, you might think that just something like a big creature, this one has 7 power and 6 toughness, would be pretty strong. Like when I first started playing this game as a child, I had this creature named Vizardrix, and since it was larger in terms of its stats than any of the other creatures I had, I assumed that has to be the most powerful card I own. But that card, as well as this one, are quite weak because their stats have to be compared to their cost. Like if you had a tiny squirrel creature, but it cost barely any mana, that would probably be more powerful than many creatures that cost a bunch of mana and then have pretty large stats. Some other types of card that seemed super powerful when I was younger included ones that might give you a ton of life, although this card's pretty awful, or ones that might deal a ton of damage to your opponent, or cards that even had phrases on them like win the game or loses the game. Like this one, if you can successfully activate it, your opponent just loses. When I first got this card, I thought it was the most powerful thing possible, and it's not quite as bad as these cards. But due to all of that mana in all 5 colors that you have to pay to try and activate it, it's not a great card. Often beginner players can even be tricked by thinking that if a card has a really big, multicolored, crazy-looking mana cost, that it would have to be powerful, right? But a lot of the cards with hard-to-play mana costs just aren't worth their effects. Over time, they've printed bigger and better creatures that would have blown my mind if I had seen them as a kid, as well as new card types such as planeswalkers that can have extremely strong abilities too. Now, when I looked at which cards were within those 35 superbanned cards, I was quite surprised to find that they contain no creatures, no planeswalkers, no multicolored cards, nothing that deals damage to your opponent, nothing that gains you life, nothing that says win the game or lose the game on it. The cards that actually are in those in those 35. What type of effects on a card would cause it to be in that superbanned set? If you analyze these 35 cards, you'll note that a huge proportion of them came from the first few years of the game. They are very skewed toward the early years, with a few notable chunks of mistakes that came later. And then you'll notice that all of the mana values, or mana cost if you just add up the total number, not caring about color, are really low. In fact, all of the ones on this list that have a relatively large mana value have some way to reduce that cost and are pretty much never played for that actually full cost. Now, if we look at the mana values that these 35 cards are typically played for, letting the ones with cost reduction effects be treated as their lower, more commonly played cost, we'll find that the average mana value is less than 2. Closer to 1.5, which is absurdly low for a typical Magic card, and not what a beginner player would necessarily expect would be the most powerful cards. Like, usually, you have a card that costs 1 mana, and you expect it to be alright if you get it in early game, but not a super powerful card. So why are all these cheap cards so powerful? Now remember, in Magic, you can have cards with bigger effects or smaller effects be similarly powerful if you balance their costs. So the cards on this list are often cards with imbalanced costs, meaning that they didn't necessarily have some massive effect, but for whatever effect they had, they cost too little. We'll also find that cards that let you draw more cards are quite important, and that in fact every single card in a way has a cost of -1 card from your hand in addition to whatever mana it costs. And any cards that manage to overcome that fact that every other card subtracts the amount you'd naturally draw into your hand that turn can be quite powerful. In fact, a huge proportion of these cards not only have mana values that are too low for their effect, but even add mana that you could use to play other cards. Some of the most powerful cards of all time are ones that cost 0 or 1 mana and add more than that, such as the classic Black Lotus. Along with Black Lotus, the rest of the Power 9 also appear on this super banned list. They include cards like one that lets you take a whole extra turn for just 2 mana total, one that lets you recycle what's left of your hand into an entirely new hand, and of course that one that lets you draw 3 cards for way too cheap, like I mentioned earlier, and will come back again in this episode, as well as a cycle of 5 cards that are artifacts that produce mana while costing nothing. Remember I said a cycle is when they make 5 similar cards that have an effect related to different colors. But unlike some of the cycles where they have some cost of that color and an effect related to the theme or mood of that color in Magic the Gathering's lore, in this case, the moxes, or some people call the plural moxen, cost nothing and can tap each turn to add 1 mana of a particular color. Old cards were written a bit differently. These cards, although they look like they're written weirdly, basically are artifacts that cost nothing and can tap any turn to add a mana of that color. And unlike a land, which also often taps for a single colored mana, lands you can only play up to 1 per turn, and whether or not you've already played your land for the turn, if you happen to have any of these moxen in your hand, you can just dump them on the board and have a huge mana advantage, basically be playing things that are meant to be played on turn 3 or 4 on your first turn. And even outside this Power 9, there are some cards that produce too much mana too quickly, and that's why they're on this list, such as this card Soul Ring, which many players consider to be almost as powerful as a card like Black Lotus, and potentially should have been on the Power 9 if it hadn't been reprinted in later sets, unlike the Power 9, because it was from the first set originally and is arguably as powerful as those. It only creates colorless mana and does cost 1 to play, but it doesn't die when you use it. You can use it every turn. Some other similar ones on this list include Mana Crypt, which costs 0 but has another downside to it, although many players think that downside still is worth it for its 0 cost, and that it might be even more powerful than Soul Ring in some circumstances. And you have one called Mana Vault. There's also some lands that produce way too much mana, like Tolarian Academy here, which adds a blue mana for each artifact you control, meaning that if you didn't have any artifacts, it couldn't add anything. If you had 1 artifact, it would be functioning kind of similar to an island, one of the basic lands. And if you had more artifacts, which in some decks are very easy to get into play with all these 0-costed artifacts, then you get 1 blue mana for each of them. Apart from cheating out mana too quickly, another trait many cards on this list have in common is that they let you draw cards. The amount of cards you have in your hand as options for what you could play later are a very important resource. And mana and cards, along with one other kind of resource we'll discuss in a minute, turn out to be so important that if cards let you get them too quickly, you're likely to win the game. If you have more cards in your hand, then you have more options for the right lands to play, the right broken overpowered cards to play, or fair cards to play, or everything compared to your opponent. And so drawing cards is quite powerful. Like how we mentioned the card Ancestral Recall, that for 1 blue mana lets you draw 3 cards. And the rest of the card drawing ones on this list of the 35 superbanned are not quite that powerful, but even the ones that come close to that, or try and be some fixed version of it with a huge downside, still ended up on this list. Nowadays, if you want to draw 3 cards, it's going to cost you many times as much mana. Another sort of resource of sorts that you could consider a lot of cards on this list helping you cheat is randomness. When you play a game of Magic, you have to shuffle your deck and draw a random hand, and you can't pick whether the next card you draw from your deck is going to be the best one in your deck that you want next. However, there's some cards, often nicknamed tutors after this one, Demonic Tutor, which let you search cards from your deck and put them either on top of your deck, so you'll draw them next, or just directly into your hand. And these not only sometimes help you draw something, but even the ones that don't draw at all and just put it on top of the deck help you cheat a certain resource, I would say, which is the randomness that's supposed to be inherent to the matches of Magic. And so many cards that let you search something out of your deck that is the perfect thing to use at that moment, and then make sure that you have that to play next, showed up on this list. A lot of cards can even be considered mixes of these traits, like how some of the tutors not only cheat randomness, but also draw you the card right away. There's also ones that we could consider to cheat randomness and mana, and other combinations of these 3 resources. Almost every card among these 35 helps you cheat one of those 3 specific resources. There are a couple sort of exceptions, like this card Balance, which doesn't really relate to those resources as much, although it kills your opponent's versions of those resources if you use it right, and is just undercosted for its effect. And cards like this one, Flash, which seems like maybe it could help you cheat mana somehow. It lets you put something from your hand into play at instant speed, but then it says that if you don't pay the cost of the thing, it dies. And this card less is on this list because it really would help you cheat mana in a general situation, and more so because it fit into one absurd combo with this card Protean Hulk, this Flash Hulk deck as it was known. You could just use the 2 mana to pay for Flash to put Protean Hulk into play, intend on not paying its full cost to let it die, and then it let you get all these creatures out of your deck, which, if you had the right cards in your deck, could be an instant win condition. If we look at the card on this list that we would say is best at cheating each of those 3 resources, well, the one that's best at cheating randomness is arguably Demonic Tutor, although some of the other ones here could be better in other circumstances. Then the one that's best at making mana is, in almost every circumstance, going to be considered Black Lotus, one of those power 9 that adds 3 mana on the first turn for nothing. In fact, if you had a land too, you'd have 4 mana total on that turn, which is just way too absurdly powerful to let a player start out their game with if they're lucky enough to draw that card. But some of the other ones are debatably as powerful in other circumstances because they don't die right away. So there are also some arguments that these cards Soul Ring and Mana Crypt could be considered as powerful as Black Lotus. Now, when we come to card draw, there's a pretty clear winner among these 35. Ancestral Recall is just way too powerful at drawing you cards whenever. So let's remember Ancestral Recall, as well as Black Lotus and its friends, Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, which will come back later in the episode. But for now, I want to move past these 35 super banned cards, because those aren't the only cards that have been exceptionally broken in the history of Magic. There are also a few cards that, under almost any metric, could be considered contenders for the greatest or strongest ever but they aren't among those 35 for historical reasons. Now, we were looking at cards that were banned in the format Legacy and restricted to a maximum of 1 copy per deck at most in Vintage. But we can go a layer deeper, and there are some cards, 44 currently, that are banned in both formats. Now, Vintage, the format, tries to never ban a card for power level reasons, meaning that even if a card is super powerful, they want to let you use up to 1 of them in your deck. Most of the cards which have ever been banned in both of those formats, which we'll nickname our hyperbanned cards, are cards that just don't work within the current rules of Magic anymore. Because like I said, it kind of began out as a different sort of game. But there's a few different types of reasons cards do show up among these 44 currently hyperbanned cards. For example, there's one card that makes you go into a sub-game of Magic, and if you were to play another one of those, you would go into a sub-game of a sub-game, and it turned out that it was not only incredibly confusing to make these sub-games try and line up with the rest of the official rules, but it was also just making games take way too long. If you played enough of those copies, you could be several layers of sub-game deep. So that card was banned in both formats just because it was kind of messing up the rule structure and fun of the game. Then there are some cards in the earlier days that had such wacky rules that the Magic designers decided we're just not going to let that be part of the game anymore. Like, there are 2 cards which are in a category known as dexterity cards, where you are literally supposed to flip the card and it matters which cards it would hit on the table. Now, not only is this something that does not translate to many structures of play or player well, but it also was making players spread their cards really far out on the table so that if the opponent had one of those, they could only hit 1 at a time. And so that was making the games take too much physical space, as well as just being an aspect they didn't want to include in the game anymore. Then there are some other cards which have been designed just for drafting, a structure called limited, where you just get a few packs of something that you don't know which random cards exactly will be in them. You have to pass them around the table while drafting and picking them, and then assemble a deck from that which you play the other people with. There are some versions of draft that they've made experimental for a singular set, such as one called Conspiracy, where if you drafted one of these conspiracy cards, you got to begin the game with it just already in play. Even better than being able to draw an extra card at the beginning, because you know it's a pretty powerful one and it's automatically just there on the battlefield, as they call the in-play zone. And these conspiracy cards were never intended to be legal in formats like Vintage or Legacy. They were designed just for that draft structure. This does make us consider which types of cards exactly are we allowing in this contest. Like, we're not allowing cards from the joke sets called unsets, which do have silver borders or little symbols at the bottom to signify that they're not for official tournament play. But these conspiracy cards look a little more like a typical Magic card, and they were used in the official draft format at the time. We're not going to include conspiracies in the rest of our analysis, partially because they weren't intended to be used in any format apart from that drafting, and partially because if we did allow these to be considered as cards we could use up to 4 of in a given deck, they would be absurdly powerful. Some of the effects they give you that you get to start with in play for free would make many of them auto-includes in practically any deck, and would make some of them arguably the most powerful cards ever. There are also some cards that are on this hyperbanned list because the game designers later decided that they were culturally insensitive, like something about their art or title was racist or something. And then there's one more category of cards that are hyperbanned that includes a really important contender for strongest card ever. This category of cards are the ones that mention the ante mechanic. In the original years of the game, as the creator Richard Garfield envisioned, there was a zone known as the ante zone, where each player would randomly put a card from their deck at the beginning of the game, and the winner would get both of them. And the intention was that this would not only make it more of a communal, maybe poker-like type of game, but also that you'd be discouraged from keeping too many of a certain powerful card in your deck in case you lost one to an opponent. But players didn't like the idea of feeling like they had lost a card to their opponent. Now, any cards that mention this ante, such as cards that give you an additional benefit at the cost of having to add an extra card to that ante that you might fully lose to your opponent if you lose the game, are now not allowed in any tournaments. And although they are on the list that is technically called banned in Vintage and such, they also just say on the card, if you're not playing for ante, you're not allowed to use the ante card. Out of the 9 cards which reference ante and say on the cards themselves that they should not be played in a game that doesn't involve ante, which means they shouldn't be played in any current formats, 8 of those cards aren't exceptionally powerful. However, there's a card called Contract from Below, which makes you ante an additional card as part of the process, which ends up meaning that if you lose the game, you'll lose 2 cards you have to give your opponent instead of 1. But what this card lets you do is draw 8 different cards, pick which one of those you want to ante off, and keep the other 7 in your hand. Now, you do need to discard the hand that you currently had before you played this. Now, maybe you have a bad hand and you want to replace it, and this is the cheapest cost to replace an entire hand you'll find in the game of Magic. Or maybe you have a really good hand, you're able to play the best things out of it and then replace it with a ton of cards. Because if you had, say, 3 cards in your hand, apart from Contract from Below, which you play, and then you get to draw 8 and have to ante 1, that's basically gaining 4 cards. Which, remember how powerful Ancestral Recall is at drawing 3 cards for 1 mana. Well, this is pretty powerful for letting you draw the difference between your current hand and 7 in a single mana. Now, all these factors add up to many players considering this card the most powerful card in the game. But we do have to consider what metrics we're using to judge that. For example, are we considering that you are anteing a second card you might lose? Or are we considering that it's so much more likely that you'll win the game with this card, you'll probably get to keep your ante, and we're minimizing how much the ante matters because our experiment is just about winning the game? I don't know, the experiment changes when you look at the old, different version of Magic that had ante. So it's hard to say if we should consider Contract from Below the greatest card of all time or completely forbidden from our experiment. However, even our superbanned and hyperbanned cards don't tell the full story. Although there's only 44 currently hyperbanned cards, if we look back in time a bit, there's one very notable example to talk about of a card that used to be hyperbanned before some things changed, and it was for power level reasons. It was banned even in the format Vintage, which tries to only restrict cards and not ban them, and it wasn't because it was racist or didn't fit in with the modern rules or made you ante or whatever. It was because it was too strong. In fact, the only reason why this card was ever unbanned in Vintage was that the game designers had to completely change not only the card, but how an ability on the card worked. You see, this card was one of 10 cards that they tested out an ability known as Companion on. And it turned out that this Companion mechanic was one of the stupidest mistakes the game designers had ever made. And they had to edit not just each of these cards, but how the entire ability worked. As we've said, in Magic, you start with 7 cards in your hand and only naturally get to draw 1 per turn unless you have other cards helping you. And the amount of cards you have in your hand is a huge resource, as well as what they are. Whether you've gotten all of the cards out of your 60 card deck that you wanted. We called those cheating card draw and cheating randomness. This companion mechanic cheated both of those by essentially not only giving you an 8th card in your opening hand, but letting you know that it was going to be a specific powerful card. Each of these 10 companions had some restriction where if your deck lined up with its restriction, you were allowed to start with it in some separate zone. You didn't need to shuffle it into your deck and hope to draw it. It just began as the only card you had in that zone, and then you were able to play it from that zone, as if you just had a bonus card in your hand that happens to be a really powerful one every single game you play. That's not going to increase the fairness or the fun of the game, and it turned out that many of these companion cards were quite broken in different formats. And the most broken was perhaps this one, Lurrus of the Dream Den. This one had not only a requirement that lined up quite well with formats like Vintage, that already often had decks that would just happen to line up with that requirement, not even make you change your deck construction and still get that free bonus card, which to me completely breaks the way Magic's supposed to work. You can't have a 30-year running game where you have 7 randomized cards in your hand and then you just say one day, well, hey, what if you buy this particular card, tweak your deck ever so slightly, and then you're the only one who gets an 8th card in your hand? Come on. Now, this companion mechanic on this card, Lurrus, was especially broken because in the Vintage formats where it lined up super easily with, its ability also let you bring back from your graveyard or dead pile many powerful, cheap-costed artifacts that are only able to be played in Vintage. Because remember, if a card like Black Lotus is restricted in Vintage, that does mean you still get up to 1 copy of it. Now, if you had this Lurrus card as your companion, and you happened to draw a Black Lotus in your opening hand of a Vintage game, you could use the Black Lotus to play the Lurrus, which you didn't even have to randomly get, it's just automatically hanging out in your companion zone, play the Lurrus, and then use its ability to get the Black Lotus right back and use that for something else. We noted that in Vintage, if a card was too powerful, they didn't fully ban it. They would just restrict it to a maximum of 1 copy per deck. But with this companion mechanic, restricting wouldn't help, because restricting to 1 copy makes you draw the card in less games and makes it less often that you get your way too powerful card every single game. But the companion mechanic guaranteed that even with just one of them, you'd get it every game. So this card, restricting it in Vintage, wouldn't have been enough. They had to ban it. These companion cards were so problematic that the game designers realized we can't just edit every single one of these cards to make them weaker. We messed up on the entire mechanic they all have in common. We need to edit the entire mechanic. And so the game designers completely changed how companion works. The older versions of the cards we can see here say that you just get to play the card from your companion zone. However, you'll notice that newer printings of the cards say that you have to pay 3 extra mana in addition to the card's cost to play it from the companion zone, which is a huge weakening of the power level of these cards. Once this change to the entire companion mechanic was implemented in the rules, this weakened all 10 of the companions so much that several of them had been banned in a format and now could be unbanned. And Lurrus was not only able to be unbanned in Vintage, but didn't even need to be restricted anymore, although it is still banned in Legacy. Now, altogether, when we look at this card's current state, it does not seem like it deserves a spot on the most powerful cards ever list. However, many players believe that the version of Lurrus that existed before this mechanic was changed could be considered at least the most powerful creature of all time, if not the most powerful card of all time. Now, when looking at the most powerful cards, we might also want to look at other formats that aren't these 60-card Vintage and Legacy type formats. For example, if we were to look at Commander, a somewhat newer format, which is multiplayer, we could find cards that are not banned in Legacy, not restricted in Vintage, yet are banned in Commander because their effect is too good in a multiplayer game of that sort. We could also look at other formats, such as the one known as limited drafting. Although we're not allowing the conspiracies in this analysis, what if we did allow cards that were legal in all of the regular formats, but which weren't that powerful in other formats, but might be insanely powerful in a draft? That if you got one of those in your draft deck, it might be even better than if you had magically been able to get like a Black Lotus in there. Well, there is an interesting story. Now, the way draft works is you pass cards from random packs from a certain era of Magic around a circle, slowly collecting some of them that you want to include most of into a deck that only has to be at least 40 cards. And most of the cards you've drafted are non-lands, so you get to use any amount of basic lands, the 5 most generic mana producers. As a kid, I loved drafting. It was probably my favorite way to play the game, partially because I was a kid, often playing against adults at game shops, and there's already maybe a bit of skill difference in terms of knowledge there, but the drafts made it much more equalized and fair and closer to just luck and strategy mattering, as opposed to things like money being a factor, where if you have a pre-constructed deck, you're going to have a better deck if you have more money than the other player. When I was researching this, though, I found some historical stories of times when a card was overpowered enough in the draft format to make the games incredibly unfair, where if you got that card to use in your deck, it was very likely that you would win. And one of these cases is a pretty funny story. So there was this card, Pack Rat, that you could play it and then discard other cards from your hand if you had black mana, like a swamp could make, and some other cards in your hand to use, and this would create more pack rats. Now, it turned out that if you drafted just 2 of these pack rats, the ideal deck to use would often be ignoring all the other cards you drafted and using 38 swamps and those 2 pack rats to mulligan, which is a hand filtration process you get to do at the beginning of the game, until you hopefully had just one of those pack rats in your hand. And then with all the swamps for fuel, you'd probably be able to win the game. And in fact, I read that even if you just drafted 1 pack rat and used that and 39 swamps, that you'd have a decent chance of winning the draft. And to note some other cards that have apparently been overpowered in eras of drafts include Sprout Swarm and Umezawa's Jite. But this pack rat one might be the most powerful card ever in a draft format. And with how much I like draft and it being an official sanctioned mode of playing, I think that does give pack rat a spot on our list of could be potentially considered one of the most powerful cards in Magic. Now, there's another card I want to mention as sort of a joke inclusion, but you know, a lot of jokes have some truth to them. Some Magic players joke that the most powerful card ever is the basic island, because there have been many eras of Magic where blue was slightly more powerful than the other colors. And although this isn't even the best land in most circumstances to create blue mana, it is one that, since you can include any amount of it in your deck, and it's been around since the very beginning of the game, it has powered many of the strongest decks throughout history. So if we had a different metric and sort of went for quantity instead of quality, and just looked at how many decks that have won tournaments contained a given card, and looked for the card that had been in the most quantity of decks that had done well before, well, that would be a basic land, and probably the island. Now, after all of these investigations, a lot of you might be wondering, what do I think is the most powerful card in Magic? There's many metrics. Here are some of the cards I think that could be considered the most powerful, but some of these are only powerful in certain formats. Some of these are only powerful if we allow to consider their version before their mechanic got changed. Now, if we did allow the outdated anti-mechanic without allowing things like those conspiracies, I would say that Contract from Below has to be the most powerful Magic card. However, Ante says on the card itself that it's not allowed if you're not playing in a format that uses that. And so these cards, I don't think we should consider in the same way we consider our other main contenders, which would have to be Black Lotus versus Ancestral Recall. Now, a lot of people think Black Lotus has to be the most powerful Magic card because it is the most expensive Magic card, at least in its original printing. Creating 3 mana at the beginning of the game can be insanely powerful, but later in the game, if you drew a Black Lotus, it wouldn't be quite as powerful because that extra 3 mana might not be quite as beneficial. Whereas a card like Ancestral Recall, at any point in the game, if you draw this, you will have a huge benefit. Now we have to come to the question of, do we consider a downgrade of Ancestral Recall being that it requires a blue mana? Ancestral Recall should only be played in a blue deck, and that should seem like a downgrade to this card. That Black Lotus could function in pretty much any deck. You don't need to have a color function for this to help. But Ancestral Recall, if you don't have your blue mana, you can't play this thing. However, even in the vintage format, where each of these cards are restricted to up to 1 copy maximum instead of 4, a lot of decks decide to put in some lands that produce blue mana just to play Ancestral Recall. So normally, the fact that something costs colored mana would be considered a downgrade because it would only fit into certain decks. But if this is a card that decks purposefully finds some way or another to get that color just to play the card, maybe we should not consider that as a downgrade considered the Black Lotus. And overall, if I have to pick one single Magic card that I say under all the metrics is the best of all, it's Ancestral Recall. Draw 3 cards for 1 mana. That's crazy. So after studying this game for a while, what have I learned? Oh my god, what have I learned? One of the most important things I learned while studying this game was how important resources are in games, and how a card could be too powerful if it let players get these resources too quickly. And I don't mean the resource of your life total, which actually is less important to worry about than a lot of players think. I mean the resources of how many cards are in your hand, how much mana you can make to play those cards, and theoretically we could see as another resource the ability to cheat randomness in a way. Cards that allow you to take some card from your deck and put it into your hand or on top of your deck so you know that'll be the one you get next. If you're able to cheat these resources, you're gonna have a broken card. That's one thing that I think a lot of new players wouldn't understand about which cards need to be banned in formats, is that it's often not the big scary looking card, because those often are fairly costed and hard to play. So the cards that need to be banned are less often the big things, and more often the cards that let you find those big things, draw them, and then play them too easily. So perhaps it's time to invent our own Perhaps it's time to invent some games of our own. Now, believe it or not, even though this episode was quite long, it was just a small chunk of the brainstorm notes I took about this game. So leave a comment if you'd like to see any other similar videos, like one about what I consider to be the worst Magic cards of all time and what that tells us about game design, or one about an interesting mathematical deck building experiment I was trying, or if you'd like to see more about the game that I've been developing. And some of that content might end up on my other bonus Demotro channel, so make sure you're tuned in there also. Thanks for joining me today in combo class. Hope you learned some interesting things about game design. Now, normally at the end of my episodes, I do a super quick thanks to the people who help make this show possible, like my Patreon supporters. But since this episode is already so ridiculously long in comparison to my usual ones, we might as well do an extended thanks to not only these people, but some other folks as well. Thank you to all my neighborhood wildlife, like all these birds. And of course, thanks to my cats. Thanks to the squirrels who hang out with me. And thanks to all the animals who help with this, who are humans, like Carlo, who is filming this right now and films a bunch of these. And special thanks to my mom. And special thanks to any aliens who happen to be watching this for whatever reason. That would be in the future because light takes a while to travel. And so, hi future aliens, if any of you are watching. Oh, whoa. And hi to President Rose and to anyone watching, thanks so much. I love you and I'll catch you again soon.